Well, if you take China, which has a macroeconomic regulator, and you have a prudential regulator,
Right.
which is different, and you have prudential regulators for banking, securities, as well as insurance. If you take, for example, a leading insurance company in China, Ping An Insurance, when they start to buy into banking businesses and so on, then you get this regulatory arbitrage problem arising here.
But not in China. In China, the regulatory commission, the Chinese Banking Regulatory Commission, is very powerful. And it looks at every institution, small or big, regional or national, multinational. So you have a uniformity of treatment, and there is no option. The question which you raise is very pertinent. There were two schools of thought which were being debated in Asia also. One is the single regulator model, where all financial services industry come under one umbrella, which is the FSA model. But then you have to have a satisfactory crisis resolution mechanism, because the Bank of England remains the lender of last resort. And the North Rock incident pointed out that the information flows were all with FSA, but the lending of last resort was with the Bank of England, and the Treasury had to foot the bill. So unless you have a very satisfactory mechanism for crisis resolution, then this model will work. But if there is ambiguity, there is lack of clarity, there are no boundary lines drawn between the various players, then you would have great difficulty. In some countries in Asia, there have been turf battles between the central bank and the FSA, which is not very good and which is exploited by the regulatory institutions. So there's no single right model. It has to be negotiated by the government with the industry. And once you have taken that into account, the two things which it requires is to be effective and to be credible.
In your time as governor of the Central Bank, State Bank of Pakistan, there's another part of the equation, which is the relationship between the regulator and government.
Yeah.
And in the case of the United States today, that relationship is even more complicated by the fact that it's government that provides the bailout money and so on. What would you say were the hallmarks of your relationship with your government in the time that you were governor? And you were governor at a most interesting time in Pakistan's history under the Musharraf regime.
Yeah.
And what would you say would be applicable to other emerging countries as a result of your experience?
I think we have to realize that the monetary, financial exchange rate policies have to work in sync with the fiscal and the trade policies. No central bank can work independent of the government. It can work independent within the government. That distinction is very important. So the reason why we were successful in raising the growth rates from almost 0.122% to 7-8% was that we worked in concert, in coordination, because there are a lot of coordination failures. But at the same time, we did not allow the government to misuse the monetary policy for their own excesses. That, I think, is very important. If you monetize the fiscal deficits, then you are actually leading to inflation, and that is exactly what happened in 2008. In 2008, the government was incoming government. There was transition. The central bank did not put its foot down, and therefore you had a monetization of the fiscal deficit. And that is a disaster. So you have to make a distinction between the larger policy coordination, but not being allowed and sucked in to become subservient to the government's own policies.
How successful were you in achieving that? And did that ability live beyond your regime? I mean, at the time that you were governor?
I think one thing which has happened is that the banking sector in Pakistan is very strong. So all the reforms which we had put in place, and we had to get the permission from the assembly from the cabinet in order to enforce all those reforms, and we got that support, are still in place. And that's the reason why, despite all the domestic problems, the global financial crisis has not hit our banking sector, and banking sector is still very profitable, very strong. Capital adequacy ratios are pretty good, non-performing loans are pretty low. So those reforms have actually been very successful over a period of time. But what happened in 2008, the transition from one regime to another was not handled very well. And there was a lot of pressure on the central bank. And the law is defective because law allows automatic creation of government debt by the central bank. So there's a need for a legal reform like India has done, which is not to allow the Ministry of Finance to create debt automatically through the central bank. That is what is missing at this moment.
But what is the ability of many emerging countries to enshrine such a capability for the central bank in the constitution? Is it
right? It is in our case. We decided that the appointment of the governor of the central bank will be only for 2 terms. It will be by the President of Pakistan, who is a non-controversial person, and he cannot be removed by anything other than corruption, mental incompetency, or his own resignation. So if you allow that kind of protection to the governor, then I think the central bank can work very independently. But if he is at the mercy of the Ministry of Finance or the Minister of Finance, then I don't think he will be or she will be able to exert that kind of influence on the government.
The global economy